In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of secrets echo through marble corridors, one man's dismissal would unleash truths that the royal family had desperately tried to bury. For 27 years, Thomas Mitchell had served the crown with unwavering loyalty, standing guard over Britain's most precious secrets. He had witnessed moments of triumph and despair, love and betrayal, life and death within those sacred walls. But on a cold February morning in 2024, when Queen Camilla's sharp words cut through the morning silence like a blade, Thomas found himself stripped of his uniform, his honor, and his silence. What the Queen didn't realize was that in her moment of rage and poor judgment, she had just freed the one man who knew the truth about Princess Diana's final days, the conversations that were never meant to be heard, and the cover-up that followed. Thomas had been more than just a guard. He had been Diana's confidant, her protector, and the keeper of her most dangerous secrets. Now, with nothing left to lose and everything to gain, he was about to reveal what really happened behind palace doors in the summer of 1997, and why Diana's death was not the tragic accident the world had been told to believe. The palace walls that had protected royal secrets for generations were about to crumble, one revelation at a time. And it all began with the Queen's moment of fury and a loyal guard's decision to finally break his silence. The morning mist clung to the windows of Buckingham Palace like ghostly fingers, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that Thomas Mitchell had grown accustomed to during his 27 years of service. At 52, his graying temples and weathered hands told the story of a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the crown. Every wrinkle on his face held a memory, every scar a testament to his unwavering loyalty. But, as he stood at his usual post outside the Queen's private quarters, adjusting his pristine uniform one final time, Thomas had no idea that this February morning would mark the end of everything he had worked for. The palace was awakening slowly, as it always did. Servants moved through the corridors like shadows, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old carpets that had witnessed the rise and fall of monarchs. The familiar sounds of morning preparations echoed through the halls, the gentle clinking of fine china, the whispered conversations of staff members, and the occasional bark of the royal corgis demanding their breakfast. Thomas found comfort in these routine sounds, a rhythm he had synchronized his life with for nearly 3 decades. Queen Camilla emerged from her chambers earlier than usual, her silk robe billowing behind her as she moved with the confidence of a woman who had finally claimed her rightful place in the monarchy. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and her blue eyes held a sharpness that Thomas had learned to recognize as dangerous. She had been in a foul mood for weeks, ever since the newspapers had begun their relentless coverage of the 26th anniversary of Diana's death approaching in August. The comparisons between the two women, the public's continued adoration of the late princess, and the subtle reminders of Diana's enduring legacy had clearly taken their toll on the current queen consort. Thomas straightened as she approached, offering the respectful bow that protocol demanded. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast golden patterns on the ornate wallpaper, and the grandfather clock in the corridor ticked away the seconds with its familiar, comforting rhythm. But there was something different in Camilla's demeanor, a tension in her shoulders, and a tightness around her eyes that suggested trouble was brewing. She paused in front of him, her gaze fixed on his face with an intensity that made Thomas shift slightly. He had served 4 different monarchs during his career, but none had ever looked at him with such obvious disdain. There was something personal in her expression, something that went beyond the usual formal distance maintained between royalty and their staff. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire about to snap. Other guards had mentioned whispered conversations in the royal quarters, hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when staff members entered the room, and an increasing paranoia about loyalty among the household staff. Thomas had dismissed these rumors as typical palace gossip, but now, facing Camilla's penetrating stare, he began to wonder if there was more truth to them than he had realized. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and precise, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. The accusations came like hammer blows, each one more shocking than the last. She spoke of betrayal and disloyalty, of conversations that should never have taken place, and confidences that had been broken. Thomas listened in stunned silence as his decades of faithful service were dismissed with a few cutting remarks, his character assassinated with the skill of someone who had learned to wield words as weapons. The most devastating blow came when Camilla mentioned Diana by name. The venom in her voice when she spoke of the late princess was unmistakable, years of jealousy and resentment finally finding their voice. She accused Thomas of harboring inappropriate loyalty to a woman who was now nothing more than a memory, of allowing his judgment to be clouded by misplaced sentimentality. The irony was not lost on Thomas that Diana, who had been dead for over 2 decades, could still inspire such fear and hatred in the woman who had taken her place. As the verbal assault continued, Thomas felt the foundations of his world crumbling beneath his feet. The uniform that had been his pride, the position that had defined his identity, the loyalty that had guided his every action, all of it was being stripped away with ruthless efficiency. He thought of his late wife, Margaret, who had been so proud of his service to the crown, who had understood the sacrifices required of a royal guard's family. She had died 3 years earlier, never knowing that this moment would come, that her husband's honor would be questioned by the very institution they had both revered. The dismissal was swift and final. Security would escort him from the premises immediately. His access to all areas of the palace was revoked effective immediately. His pension would be reviewed, and any attempts to contact members of the royal family or speak to the press would result in legal action. The message was clear. Thomas Mitchell was no longer welcome in the world he had called home for most of his adult life. As Thomas was led away by 2 younger guards who couldn't meet his eyes, he passed through corridors lined with portraits of previous monarchs. Their painted faces seemed to watch him with a mixture of sympathy and disappointment, as if they too understood the injustice of what was happening. He had walked these halls thousands of times, but never as a stranger, never as someone unwelcome. The familiar surroundings now felt foreign and hostile, transformed by his change in status from protector to pariah. The irony of his situation was not lost on him, as he was escorted past the memorial garden dedicated to Diana's memory. The bronze plaque bearing her image caught the morning light, and for a moment, Thomas could swear he saw a flicker of something in her photographed eyes, not sadness, but determination. It was then that he made his decision, standing in the shadow of the woman whose secrets he had kept for over 25 years. In the security office, as he surrendered his badge and keys, Thomas thought about the conversation he had witnessed just weeks before Diana's death. The princess had been distraught, pacing back and forth in her private sitting room while making urgent phone calls. He had been stationed outside her door, officially there for her protection, but in reality serving as her confidant and friend. She had trusted him with information that could have destroyed the monarchy, secrets that she had sworn him to keep even beyond her death. The young security officer processing his dismissal was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, fumbling with paperwork and avoiding eye contact. Thomas had trained this man, had taught him the protocols and procedures that governed palace security. Now that same officer was taking away his identity card and access codes, symbols of a trust that had been shattered by a queen's anger and fear. As Thomas signed the final documents confirming his dismissal, his hand was steady despite the turmoil in his heart. 27 years of service reduced to a signature on a termination form. But, with each stroke of the pen, his resolve strengthened. Camilla had made a crucial error in judgment. In her desire to silence what she perceived as a threat, she had actually freed the one person who could expose the truth she was so desperate to hide. Walking out of Buckingham Palace for the last time as a member of its staff, Thomas felt the weight of his secrets pressing against his chest like a physical burden. For over 2 decades, he had carried the knowledge of what really happened in the weeks before Diana's death, the phone call she had made, the documents she had hidden, and the plan she had been formulating to protect her sons from the very institution that had ultimately destroyed her. The February wind cut through his civilian clothes as he stood on the palace steps, looking back at the building that had been his second home. Tourist groups gathered behind the iron gates, taking photographs and speculating about the lives of the people inside. They had no idea that the man standing beside them had just been cast out from that golden world, carrying with him secrets that could change everything they thought they knew about the royal family. Thomas pulled out his mobile phone and stared at the contact list, his finger hovering over a number he had never expected to call. James Richardson, investigative journalist for the Sunday Times, had been trying to reach Thomas for months, following leads about Diana's final weeks. Until this morning, Thomas had deleted every message without listening to them, his loyalty to the crown absolute. But that loyalty had just been thrown back in his face by a woman who understood neither its value nor its cost. The first revelation would be about the night of August 30th, 1997, when Diana had called the palace from Paris. Not the official call that had been documented and released to the public, but the second call, the one that had never appeared in any official record. The call where she had spoken directly to Thomas, her voice filled with fear and urgency, giving him instructions that he had followed faithfully until this very day. As Thomas walked away from Buckingham Palace, disappearing into the London crowd, he carried with him the power to rewrite history. Camilla's moment of rage had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose the truth about Diana's death and the cover-up that had protected the monarchy for over 25 years. The guard who had kept silent for so long was finally ready to speak, and the palace walls that had contained these secrets for decades were about to be shattered from within. The small cafe in South Kensington hummed with the gentle murmur of afternoon conversations as Thomas Mitchell sat in the corner booth, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. 3 weeks had passed since his dismissal from Buckingham Palace, 3 weeks of sleepless nights and tormented days as he wrestled with a decision that would change everything. The weight of 27 years of secrets pressed down on him like a physical burden, but it was the memory of Diana's voice on that final phone call that ultimately drove him to pick up his phone and dial James Richardson's number. James Richardson was not what Thomas had expected. The investigative journalist was younger than anticipated, perhaps 45, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see through pretense and straight to the truth. He had arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, Thomas noted with approval, and had chosen a table that provided privacy while maintaining clear sight lines to all exits. This was a man who understood the dangerous game they were about to play. When Thomas finally began to speak, his voice was steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. He started with the basics, establishing his credentials and his unique position within the palace hierarchy. For 27 years, he had been more than just a guard. He had been a confidant to 3 generations of royals, a silent witness to their most private moments, and a keeper of secrets that could topple governments and destroy reputations. The relationship between Thomas and Princess Diana had begun in the spring of 1995, shortly after her explosive panorama interview with Martin Bashir had sent shockwaves through the establishment. Diana was vulnerable, isolated within the palace walls, and desperately in need of someone she could trust. Thomas, with his quiet demeanor and unshakable integrity, had gradually become that person. What had started as professional protection had evolved into something much more significant, a friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of the pressures of royal life. James listened without interruption as Thomas described the gradual erosion of Diana's relationship with the royal family following her divorce from Charles. The princess had become increasingly concerned about her safety, not from external threats, but from within the very institution she had once hoped to serve. She had confided in Thomas about strange incidents, cars that followed her too closely, phone calls that ended abruptly when she answered, and a growing sense that her every movement was being monitored and reported. The journalist's pen moved steadily across his notebook as Thomas revealed details that had never appeared in any official account of Diana's final years. The princess had been conducting her own investigation into the circumstances surrounding previous royal deaths, particularly those of individuals who had posed potential threats to the monarchy's reputation. She had obtained documents, photographs, and testimonies that painted a disturbing picture of an institution willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect itself. Thomas paused in his narrative to study James's reaction. The journalist's expression remained neutral, but Thomas could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. This was the story of a lifetime, but it was also potentially one of the most dangerous investigations James would ever undertake. The British establishment had long tentacles and a rich history of protecting its own interests, regardless of the cost to individual lives. The first specific revelation concerned Diana's discovery of a financial irregularity within one of the charities she supported. Through her investigation, she had uncovered a money laundering operation that involved several high-ranking members of the establishment, including at least 2 members of the House of Lords and a senior civil servant with close ties to Downing Street. The amounts involved were substantial. Over £15 million had been funneled through the charity to offshore accounts controlled by a network of individuals with connections to arms dealing and illegal weapons sales. Diana had been meticulous in her investigation, Thomas explained. She understood that accusations without ironclad proof would be dismissed as the ravings of a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge. She had spent months gathering evidence, photographing documents, recording conversations, and building a comprehensive case that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. The evidence was stored in multiple locations, with copies held by trusted individuals who had sworn to protect it with their lives. James interrupted for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked about the current location of this evidence. Thomas smiled grimly and explained that Diana had been paranoid about the security of the documents, convinced that palace operatives were monitoring her activities. She had developed an elaborate system for hiding and protecting the evidence, involving multiple safe deposit boxes, encrypted computer files, and a network of loyal friends who each held pieces of the larger puzzle. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the cafe's owner, an elderly Italian woman who refilled their teapots with the easy familiarity of someone who had been serving customers for decades. Thomas waited until she was out of earshot before continuing with the most explosive revelation yet: Diana's discovery that her phone conversations were being recorded and that transcripts were being shared with senior members of the royal family and government officials. The surveillance had begun shortly after the Panorama interview, Thomas revealed. Diana had noticed that private conversations she had held on supposedly secure phone lines were later referenced in official documents and diplomatic communications. She had tested her suspicions by deliberately providing false information during phone calls, then monitoring official channels to see if the disinformation appeared. When it did, she realized that her worst fears were confirmed. She was being treated as a security threat by the very people who were supposed to protect her. James leaned forward as Thomas described Diana's response to this discovery. Rather than retreating into silence, the princess had decided to fight back using the same tactics being employed against her. She had obtained recording equipment and had begun documenting conversations with royal family members, government officials, and other establishment figures. The resulting archive contained hundreds of hours of recordings that captured frank discussions about everything from succession plans to cover-up operations. The most damaging recording, Thomas revealed, was of a conversation between Prince Philip and a senior intelligence officer that took place just 3 weeks before Diana's death. In that conversation, Philip expressed frustration with Diana's continued investigations and her refusal to know her place following the divorce. The exact words used were burned into Thomas's memory because Diana had played the recording for him on the night she died, her voice shaking with fear and anger as she realized the full extent of the danger she faced. Thomas described how Diana's mood had changed dramatically in the final weeks of her life. The confident, defiant woman who had taken on the establishment had been replaced by someone who was genuinely frightened for her safety and the safety of her sons. She had begun making arrangements for the evidence she had gathered to be released if anything happened to her. But she had also started to question whether even these precautions would be sufficient to protect her from forces that seemed to have unlimited resources and reach. The journalist asked about the famous last phone call, the one that had been documented in official reports as a routine conversation between Diana and her sons. Thomas's expression darkened as he explained that the official account was a complete fabrication. The real last phone call had been to him, not to William and Harry, and its contents were so explosive that they had been completely suppressed from all official records. During that final conversation, Diana had been in her hotel room in Paris, preparing for what she believed would be her final public appearance. She was exhausted from months of stress and fear, but she was also determined to see her investigation through to its conclusion. She told Thomas that she had made arrangements to meet with a senior journalist the following week, someone with the courage and resources to publish her findings despite the inevitable backlash. But Diana's voice had changed during that conversation, Thomas remembered. What had started as a routine check-in had become increasingly urgent as she described strange activities around her hotel. Cars that seemed to be monitoring the building, individuals who appeared to be conducting surveillance, and a growing sense that she was being watched by professionals rather than ordinary paparazzi. She had asked Thomas to deliver a package to a specific individual if she didn't return to London as scheduled, a package that contained the most damaging evidence she had gathered. James asked the obvious question about the package, and Thomas's response sent chills down the journalist's spine. The package had never been delivered because Thomas had been ordered to report for duty at Balmoral Castle on the morning after Diana's death, effectively removing him from London during the crucial hours when arrangements for the package's delivery should have been made. By the time he returned to London 3 days later, Diana's private residence had been thoroughly searched, and all of her personal papers had been removed for security reasons. The final revelation of their first meeting concerned the official investigation into Diana's death. Thomas revealed that he had been approached by French investigators who were looking into discrepancies in the official timeline of events surrounding the car crash. The investigators had found evidence suggesting that the crash scene had been contaminated before official emergency services arrived, and they were seeking witnesses who could provide information about Diana's activities in the weeks before her death. Thomas had been specifically instructed by his superiors not to cooperate with the French investigation, despite having information that might have been relevant to their inquiries. When he had questioned these instructions, he was told that cooperation with foreign investigators required approval from the highest levels of government, and that such approval would not be forthcoming. The message was clear: Diana's death was to remain a closed book, and anyone attempting to reopen it would face serious consequences. As their meeting drew to a close, James asked Thomas why he had decided to come forward now, after maintaining silence for over 25 years. The answer was simple but profound. Queen Camilla's decision to dismiss him had released him from his oath of loyalty to the crown. Diana had made him promise to keep her secrets only as long as he remained in royal service. The moment Camilla stripped him of his position, she had unknowingly freed him to honor a different promise, the one he had made to Diana to ensure that the truth about her death would eventually come to light. Thomas handed James a small envelope containing photographs and document copies that Diana had given him for safekeeping. The contents of that envelope would form the foundation of an investigation that would ultimately expose the full extent of the conspiracy surrounding Diana's death and the lengths to which the establishment had gone to silence her permanently. As the two men parted ways in the fading afternoon light, both understood that they had just taken the first step on a journey that would either reveal the truth or destroy them both in the attempt. The documents Thomas had provided opened a window into a world that James Richardson had never imagined existed within the hallowed halls of the British establishment. Spread across his kitchen table in his modest Hampstead flat, the photographs and photocopied papers revealed the methodical nature of Diana's investigation and the shocking scope of what she had uncovered. Each piece of evidence told part of a larger story, a tale of corruption, murder, and cover-ups that reached into the highest echelons of British society. James had spent the past week verifying the authenticity of the documents through his network of sources within government agencies, forensic experts, and former intelligence operatives. Every test confirmed what he had hoped and feared in equal measure. The documents were genuine, the signatures authentic, and the implications absolutely devastating. Diana had not been the naive, emotionally unstable woman that the establishment had portrayed after her death. She had been a skilled investigator who had stumbled onto something so dangerous that it had cost her life. The centerpiece of Diana's investigation was a charity called the International Children's Foundation, ostensibly dedicated to providing medical care for children in developing countries. On the surface, it appeared to be exactly what it claimed: a legitimate charitable organization with an impressive board of directors that included several members of the House of Lords, prominent businessmen, and even a retired senior civil servant who had served 3 different prime ministers. But Diana's investigation had revealed that the charity was actually a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been moving illegal funds for over a decade. The medical supplies being shipped to developing countries were largely fictitious, existing only on paper, while the cargo containers actually carried weapons, drugs, and other contraband to various conflict zones around the world. The profits from these operations were then funneled back through the charity's accounts, emerging as apparently legitimate donations from wealthy benefactors. The scope of the operation was breathtaking in its audacity and reach. Conservative estimates suggested that over £100 million had been laundered through the charity's accounts over the course of 10 years, with the money originating from arms dealers, drug cartels, and corrupt government officials from around the globe. The British establishment's involvement in facilitating these transactions represented a level of institutional corruption that would have brought down governments if it had been exposed. James studied the bank records that Diana had somehow obtained, marveling at her resourcefulness and determination. The princess had clearly spent months learning how to trace financial transactions, understand corporate structures, and identify the shell companies and offshore accounts that were being used to hide the money trail. Her handwritten notes in the margins of documents showed a sharp intelligence and an understanding of financial crime that would have impressed seasoned investigators. The human cost of the operation became clear as James examined Diana's research into the charity's supposed beneficiaries. Villages in Africa that were listed as receiving medical supplies had never seen any aid workers or equipment. Hospitals in Asia that were supposedly being funded by the charity turned out to be abandoned buildings or facilities that had been closed for years. Children whose photographs appeared in the charity's promotional materials had either died years before the charity was established or had never existed at all. Diana had been particularly affected by the discovery that photographs of her own charitable work were being misused by the organization. Images of her visiting sick children in London hospitals had been digitally manipulated to suggest that she was endorsing the International Children's Foundation's work overseas. Her celebrity and moral authority were being exploited to give legitimacy to an operation that was causing immense suffering in the very regions she genuinely cared about helping. The investigation had begun innocently enough when Diana noticed discrepancies in the financial reports of a legitimate charity she supported. Cross-referencing donor lists and funding sources, she had discovered that several wealthy individuals were making identical donations to multiple charities on the same dates, using funds that appeared to be coming from the same offshore accounts. Her curiosity piqued. Diana had begun following the money trail, using her connections within high society to gain access to information that would have been impossible for ordinary investigators to obtain. Thomas had provided James with Diana's personal journals from the final months of her life, and reading them was like watching a woman gradually realize that she was surrounded by enemies. The early entries showed excitement and determination as she uncovered each new piece of evidence. But as the investigation progressed and the true scale of the corruption became apparent, her tone became increasingly fearful and paranoid. The turning point had come when Diana discovered that one of her closest friends within the royal circle was directly involved in the money laundering operation. Lady Margaret Thornfield, a woman who had been Diana's confidant and supporter throughout the difficult years following her divorce, was listed as a director of 3 different shell companies that were being used to move illegal funds through the charity's accounts. The betrayal had devastated Diana emotionally, while also making her realize how deeply the corruption had penetrated her personal circle. Diana's journal entries from July 1997 revealed her growing awareness that she was being watched and followed. She had noticed the same cars appearing near her home on multiple occasions, had received unusual phone calls where the caller hung up immediately, and had discovered evidence that her mail was being intercepted and examined before being delivered. Most disturbing of all, she had found listening devices hidden in her private residence during what was supposed to be routine maintenance work. The princess had responded to these discoveries with characteristic courage and determination, but also with increasing isolation and fear. She had gradually stopped confiding in friends and family members, uncertain about whom she could trust. Her relationship with her sons became strained as she tried to protect them from knowledge that could put them in danger while also preparing them for the possibility that something might happen to her. James was particularly struck by Diana's analysis of previous deaths within royal circles and the British establishment. She had compiled a comprehensive list of individuals who had died under suspicious circumstances after threatening to expose corruption or challenging the established order. The list included journalists, civil servants, business leaders, and even minor members of the royal family who had asked inconvenient questions or possessed dangerous information. Each case showed a similar pattern. Initial reports of accident or natural death, followed by cursory investigations that accepted the official explanations without serious scrutiny. Witnesses disappeared or recanted their statements, evidence went missing, and official files were sealed under national security provisions. In several cases, the individuals had died just days or weeks before they were scheduled to meet with journalists or provide testimony to parliamentary committees. The most chilling entry in Diana's journal concerned her discovery of a document that appeared to be a protocol for dealing with security threats within the royal establishment. The document, which Diana had photographed but had been unable to verify independently, outlined procedures for monitoring, intimidating, and, if necessary, eliminating individuals who posed risks to institutional stability. The clinical language of the document made it clear that these were not theoretical guidelines, but operational procedures that had been used multiple times. Diana had also uncovered evidence of foreign intelligence involvement in British domestic affairs, specifically related to protecting the money laundering operation from exposure. Agents from several countries were apparently being given access to British surveillance capabilities in exchange for their cooperation in maintaining the secrecy of the operation. This represented not just financial crime, but potential treason, as British national security resources were being used to protect foreign criminal enterprises. The complexity of the conspiracy had clearly overwhelmed Diana in her final weeks. Her journal entries showed a woman struggling to understand how deeply the corruption extended and how many supposedly trustworthy individuals were involved. She had begun to question her own judgment and her ability to distinguish between genuine threats and paranoid fantasies. But the evidence she had gathered left little room for doubt about the reality of the danger she faced. Thomas had told James that Diana's decision to go to Paris in August 1997 was directly related to her investigation. She had arranged to meet with a French investigative journalist who specialized in exposing international financial crime, someone with the resources and connections to publish her findings even if the British establishment tried to suppress them. The meeting was scheduled for September 3, 1997, 3 days after her death. The final entries in Diana's journal revealed her state of mind in the days before her trip to Paris. She had completed her investigation and was ready to go public with her findings, but she was also terrified of the consequences. She understood that exposing the money laundering operation would destroy careers, bring down governments, and potentially destabilize the monarchy itself. But she also believed that remaining silent would make her complicit in the suffering being caused by the operation's activities. Diana had made detailed arrangements for the release of her evidence if anything happened to her, but she had also taken steps to protect her sons from potential retaliation. The evidence was divided into multiple caches, with different individuals holding different pieces of the puzzle. No single person had access to all the information, ensuring that even if some caches were compromised, enough evidence would survive to tell the complete story. The sophistication of Diana's security arrangements suggested that she had received professional advice about protecting sensitive information and maintaining operational security. Thomas had mentioned that the princess had developed relationships with former intelligence operatives who had become disillusioned with their agency's activities and were willing to provide assistance to someone trying to expose institutional corruption. As James finished reviewing the documents for the third time, he realized that Diana's investigation had uncovered something far more significant than a simple money laundering operation. She had exposed the existence of a shadow system within the British establishment that operated according to its own rules and priorities, using official resources to protect private interests and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose its activities. The implications were staggering. If Diana's evidence was accurate, it meant that the British government, intelligence services, and royal establishment were all compromised by a criminal enterprise that had been operating with impunity for over a decade. The money being laundered wasn't just criminal profits. It was funding for terrorism, arms trafficking, and political manipulation on a global scale. James understood that he was now in possession of information that could change the course of British history. But he also realized that he was facing the same forces that had apparently killed Diana to keep these secrets hidden. His next move would determine not just the success of his investigation, but potentially his own survival. The question was no longer whether Diana had been murdered, but whether he would live long enough to tell the world what he had discovered. The secure meeting room in the basement of the Sunday Times building felt like a bunker as James Richardson spread Diana's evidence across the conference table. Senior editor Margaret Walsh sat in stunned silence as she absorbed the magnitude of what her investigative reporter had uncovered. The documents, recordings, and photographs painted a picture of corruption so extensive and deeply rooted that it challenged everything they thought they knew about the British establishment. Margaret had been in journalism for over 30 years, covering everything from financial scandals to political conspiracies, but nothing had prepared her for the scope of what Diana had discovered. The Princess of Wales had essentially conducted a one-woman investigation that rivaled the work of entire intelligence agencies, using her unique position within British society to access information that would have been impossible for professional investigators to obtain. The centerpiece of the evidence was a recording that Thomas had smuggled out of Buckingham Palace on the day of his dismissal. Diana had given him the device 3 weeks before her death, along with specific instructions about when and how to use it. The recording captured a conversation between senior members of the royal family, government officials, and what appeared to be foreign intelligence operatives discussing the Diana problem and various options for resolving it permanently. James played the recording for Margaret, watching her face grow pale as the clinical discussion of assassination options unfolded. The speakers talked about Diana as if she were a terrorist threat rather than a member of their own family, analyzing her movements, her security arrangements, and her relationships with people outside the establishment. The level of detail was chilling. They knew about her investigation, her evidence caches, and her plans to go public with her findings. The most shocking revelation came when one of the speakers, identified by Thomas as Prince Philip, suggested that Diana's death should appear to be the result of her own reckless behavior rather than a direct assassination. The speaker explained that public sympathy for Diana was so strong that any obvious murder would create a massive backlash against the royal family. But an accident caused by paparazzi pursuit would actually generate sympathy for the monarchy as fellow victims of media intrusion. Margaret stopped the recording and asked James to replay that section 3 times, taking detailed notes as she listened. The implications were staggering. Not only had Diana been murdered, but her killers had deliberately chosen a method that would turn her death into a propaganda victory for the very institution she had been trying to expose. The worldwide outpouring of grief for Diana had actually served to strengthen the monarchy rather than weaken it, exactly as the conspirators had planned. The recording also revealed the involvement of foreign intelligence services in the plot against Diana. Representatives from at least 3 different countries were present in the conversation, offering resources and assistance in exchange for continued protection of the money laundering operation that Diana had discovered. The international scope of the conspiracy explained how such a sophisticated assassination had been carried out while maintaining the appearance of a tragic accident. James had spent weeks verifying the authenticity of the recording using independent audio forensic experts, and their conclusions were unambiguous. The recording was genuine and had not been tampered with in any way. Voice analysis confirmed the identities of several speakers, including senior royals whose voices were well documented in public recordings. The technical evidence was solid enough to withstand legal challenges and media scrutiny. But the recording was just the beginning of Diana's evidence cache. Thomas had also provided financial documents that traced the money laundering operations connections to specific terrorist organizations, drug cartels, and arms dealers around the world. The scope of the criminal enterprise was breathtaking. Hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal funds had been cleaned through British financial institutions with the full knowledge and cooperation of government officials. Margaret examined bank statements that showed regular payments from offshore accounts to prominent British politicians, including sitting members of parliament and government ministers. The amounts were substantial enough to represent serious corruption rather than simple political donations, and the timing of the payments corresponded to specific parliamentary votes and policy decisions that benefited the criminal organizations involved in the money laundering scheme. The human cost of the operation became clear as James presented Diana's research into the real-world consequences of the money laundering. Weapons purchased with cleaned funds had been used in genocides across Africa, drug money had fueled addiction epidemics in South America, and terrorist financing had supported attacks that had killed thousands of innocent people. Diana had understood that her investigation wasn't just about financial crime. It was about preventing future atrocities. Thomas had provided additional context about Diana's final weeks that wasn't contained in any written records. The princess had been receiving direct threats from unknown sources, including photographs of her sons with crosshairs drawn over their faces and detailed descriptions of their daily routines. The psychological pressure had been enormous, but Diana had refused to abandon her investigation despite the obvious danger to herself and her family. The threats had escalated dramatically after Diana arranged her meeting with the French journalist. Within hours of making the appointment, she had received a phone call from someone claiming to represent concerned parties who suggested that she cancel her trip to Paris and abandon her investigation. When Diana refused, the caller became more explicit, describing various accidents that could befall someone who didn't understand the rules of the game they were playing. Margaret asked James about corroborating evidence for the threats, and Thomas had provided recordings that Diana had made of several threatening phone calls. The voices were electronically disguised, but the content was unmistakably clear. Diana was being warned to stop her investigation or face consequences that would extend beyond her own life, to include her sons and anyone else she cared about. The most damning piece of evidence was a document that appeared to be an operational plan for Diana's assassination, complete with detailed timelines, personnel assignments, and contingency procedures. The document outlined how the crash would be staged, how evidence would be manipulated, and how the subsequent investigation would be controlled to ensure that the official conclusion supported the accidental death narrative. James had traced the document's origins through watermarks and paper analysis, discovering that it had been produced on equipment used by British intelligence services. The technical specifications for the assassination device matched equipment that was known to be used by MI6 for overseas operations, suggesting that domestic intelligence capabilities were being used against a British citizen on British soil. The operational plan also revealed how extensively the conspirators had prepared for the aftermath of Diana's death. They had developed strategies for controlling media coverage, managing public reaction, and ensuring that any subsequent investigations would be limited in scope and reach predetermined conclusions. The level of preparation suggested that Diana's assassination had been planned months in advance, not as a hasty response to immediate threats. Margaret was particularly struck by the document's analysis of public opinion and media manipulation strategies. The conspirators had clearly understood that Diana's death would generate enormous public grief and anger, and they had developed sophisticated plans for channeling those emotions in directions that would actually benefit the monarchy rather than threaten it. The transformation of Diana from a dangerous rebel into a beloved martyr had been carefully orchestrated from the beginning. The evidence also revealed corruption within the investigation itself, both in Britain and France. Senior investigators had been compromised through bribery, blackmail, or simple career threats, ensuring that crucial evidence would be overlooked and inconvenient witnesses would be discredited or silenced. The fix had been comprehensive, involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. James presented Thomas's account of his own role in the cover-up, which had begun immediately after Diana's death. Royal protection officers had been instructed to provide false statements about Diana's movements and communications in her final weeks, creating an official timeline that concealed her investigative activities and her growing awareness of the threats against her. Thomas himself had been ordered to destroy evidence that he knew existed in Diana's private quarters, including computer files, documents, and recording equipment. When he had hesitated to follow these orders, he had been reminded that his pension and his family's security depended on his cooperation with the official narrative. The pressure had been subtle but unmistakable: participate in the cover-up or face serious consequences. The international dimension of the conspiracy became clearer as Margaret examined communications between British officials and their counterparts in other countries. The money laundering operation had tentacles reaching into dozens of nations, and Diana's investigation had threatened to expose corruption networks that extended far beyond Britain's borders. Her death had protected criminals and corrupt officials around the world. Margaret realized that they were looking at evidence of what amounted to a shadow government operating within the British establishment, answerable to no democratic authority and willing to commit murder to protect its interests. The revelation that such a system existed and had been operating for decades represented a fundamental challenge to everything the British public believed about their government and institutions. The question facing Margaret and James was how to publish such explosive information without being destroyed by the very forces they were trying to expose. Previous attempts to investigate the circumstances surrounding Diana's death had been systematically undermined through legal challenges, character assassination, and mysterious accidents befalling key witnesses. They would need to be extraordinarily careful about how they proceeded. Thomas had warned them that once they began publishing, they would become targets themselves. The same people who had killed Diana to protect their secrets would not hesitate to eliminate journalists who threatened to expose the truth. But he had also provided them with Diana's insurance policy, evidence caches hidden in multiple locations around the world, ready to be released if anything happened to the people working to expose the conspiracy. As Margaret and James planned their publication strategy, they understood that they were about to challenge some of the most powerful people in Britain and potentially bring down institutions that had stood for centuries. The evidence was compelling, but the risks were enormous. Diana had died trying to expose this conspiracy, and they could very well suffer the same fate. But they also understood that remaining silent would make them complicit in covering up not just Diana's murder, but an ongoing criminal enterprise that continued to cause suffering around the world. The princess had died believing that the truth would eventually come out, and they were now the custodians of her legacy and her evidence. The decision to publish wasn't really a choice. It was a moral imperative that Diana's sacrifice would not be in vain. The publication of the Diana files sent shockwaves around the world that reverberated far beyond anyone's expectations. James Richardson's meticulously researched series in the Sunday Times didn't just reveal the truth about Diana's death. It exposed an entire network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, intelligence services, and the royal family itself. Within hours of the first article's publication, the story had been picked up by news organizations across the globe, creating a media frenzy unlike anything seen since Diana's death 27 years earlier. The initial response from official sources followed a predictable pattern of denial and deflection. Buckingham Palace issued a statement calling the allegations baseless conspiracy theories and deeply hurtful to the royal family and the memory of the late princess. Government spokespeople dismissed the evidence as fabrications created by disgruntled former employees seeking attention and financial gain. Intelligence agencies declined to comment on matters of national security, but unofficial sources suggested that the documents had been taken out of context or deliberately misinterpreted. But the evidence was too compelling and too extensive to be easily dismissed. James had learned from Diana's mistakes, building redundancy and protection into every aspect of his investigation. Independent experts had verified every document, recording, and photograph before publication. Multiple copies of all evidence had been distributed to journalists and legal experts around the world, making it impossible for the authorities to suppress the story through intimidation or legal action. The international response was swift and devastating for the British establishment. European Union officials called for a full investigation into British money laundering activities that had facilitated international crime. The United Nations opened inquiries into the use of cleaned funds for weapons trafficking and terrorist financing. Several countries froze assets held in British financial institutions while they investigated potential connections to the exposed criminal network. Thomas Mitchell found himself transformed overnight from dismissed palace guard to international celebrity and whistleblower hero. Television crews camped outside his modest flat in South London, seeking interviews and additional information about his years of service within the royal household. Initially overwhelmed by the attention, Thomas gradually began to embrace his role as Diana's advocate and the guardian of her legacy. The first cracks in the official denials appeared when several junior government officials began providing information to investigators, seeking immunity from prosecution in exchange for their cooperation. The money laundering operation had involved so many people and institutions that complete secrecy became impossible once public attention was focused on the issue. Lower-level participants began to realize that they were likely to become scapegoats unless they spoke out first. Queen Camilla's response to the crisis was characteristically defensive and tone-deaf. Instead of expressing concern about the serious allegations being made, she focused on attacking the credibility of Thomas and James, describing them as publicity seekers who were exploiting Diana's memory for personal gain. Her harsh rhetoric only served to draw more attention to the story and reinforce public suspicions that the royal family had something to hide. The recording of Prince Philip and other senior officials discussing Diana's assassination became the most damaging piece of evidence, played repeatedly on television and radio programs around the world. Forensic audio experts continued to verify its authenticity, and no credible challenge to the recording's legitimacy emerged despite enormous pressure from official sources to discredit it. Parliamentary opposition leaders demanded a full public inquiry into the allegations, with powers to subpoena witnesses and examine classified documents. The government initially resisted these calls, citing national security concerns, but public pressure became overwhelming as polls showed that over 70% of British citizens believed that Diana had been murdered and that a cover-up had taken place. The international financial community began distancing itself from British institutions implicated in the money laundering scandal. Several major banks faced criminal investigations in multiple jurisdictions, and billions of pounds in assets were frozen while authorities traced the movement of illegal funds. The reputational damage to London's financial sector was enormous, with many international clients moving their business to other financial centers. Thomas revealed additional details about palace life that hadn't appeared in the initial articles, describing a culture of secrecy and intimidation that extended far beyond Diana's case. He spoke about other suspicious deaths, unexplained accidents, and mysterious disappearances of individuals who had posed potential threats to royal or government interests. His revelations painted a picture of an establishment that routinely eliminated problems through violence while maintaining a facade of respectability. The most dramatic moment came when Thomas produced Diana's personal insurance policy, a collection of documents and recordings that she had specifically prepared for release after her death. Hidden in secure locations around the world for over 25 years, these materials provided additional confirmation of everything that had already been revealed, while also exposing new dimensions of the conspiracy. Diana's insurance policy included detailed financial records showing exactly how money laundering proceeds had been distributed among co-conspirators, including specific amounts paid to individual royals, politicians, and intelligence operatives. The revelation that senior members of the royal family had personally profited from criminal activities created a constitutional crisis that threatened the very existence of the monarchy. The evidence also revealed that Diana's investigation had been far more advanced than previously understood. She had identified additional criminal enterprises operating under establishment protection, including human trafficking networks, illegal weapons manufacturing, and systematic tax evasion schemes involving offshore trusts controlled by prominent British families. Her death had prevented the exposure of crimes that extended far beyond the money laundering operation. International arrest warrants were issued for several British nationals implicated in the evidence, creating diplomatic tensions as the government was forced to choose between protecting criminals and maintaining international relationships. Several senior civil servants and intelligence officials fled the country rather than face questioning, effectively confirming their guilt through their actions. The impact on the royal family was devastating and irreversible. Public support for the monarchy collapsed as the extent of their involvement in criminal activities became clear. Protesters gathered outside Buckingham Palace daily, demanding the abolition of the royal family and the establishment of a republic. Opinion polls showed that support for the monarchy had fallen to historic lows, with younger generations overwhelmingly opposed to maintaining the institution. King Charles faced the impossible task of trying to defend an institution that had been thoroughly discredited by the evidence of its criminal activities. His initial attempts to dismiss the allegations as attacks on the crown only increased public anger and calls for his abdication. The revelation that he had been aware of at least some aspects of the money laundering operation made his position completely untenable. Queen Camilla's role in dismissing Thomas became a symbol of the establishment's arrogance and disregard for justice. Her decision to remove the one person who could have kept Diana's secrets hidden was widely seen as the moment when the conspiracy finally began to unravel. The irony was not lost on commentators that Camilla's own actions had ultimately led to the exposure of the truth she had spent decades trying to suppress. The legal consequences began to unfold as special prosecutors were appointed to investigate the criminal activities revealed in Diana's evidence. Senior judges who had been involved in covering up previous investigations were forced to recuse themselves, and international legal experts were brought in to ensure the integrity of the proceedings. The prosecutions promised to be the most significant in British legal history. Thomas emerged as a key witness in multiple criminal proceedings, his testimony providing crucial context for Diana's evidence, and helping prosecutors understand the full scope of the criminal conspiracy. Despite receiving numerous threats and facing constant security concerns, he remained committed to seeing justice done for Diana and holding all responsible parties accountable for their actions. The transformation of Thomas from loyal palace guard to international hero represented the power of individual conscience to challenge institutional corruption. His decision to honor his promise to Diana, despite the personal risks involved, had ultimately exposed one of the most significant criminal conspiracies in modern history. His courage inspired others to come forward with additional evidence, creating a cascade of revelations that continued to expand the scope of the investigation. The story of Diana's secret investigation and its explosive aftermath became a watershed moment in British history, marking the end of an era of establishment immunity and the beginning of a new age of accountability. The princess who had been silenced by murder had ultimately found her voice through the courage of a dismissed palace guard who refused to let her truth remain buried. As the investigations continued and prosecutions began, it became clear that Diana's death had been just one crime in a vast network of institutional corruption that had operated with impunity for decades. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. It had provided the evidence and inspiration necessary to finally bring down a system that had placed itself above the law and beyond accountability. The legacy of Diana's investigation would reshape British society for generations to come, ensuring that never again would such a comprehensive conspiracy be able to operate in the shadows while claiming to serve the public interest. Thomas Mitchell had kept his promise to a princess, and, in doing so, had changed the course of history itself.